The U.S. objective is clearly stated in the RAND Corporation strategy that the United States is implementing now. Their objective is to bring down the GDP of China by as much as 35% by 2025 by launching a conventional, a regional, and a protracted war. And it is ongoing now. So that is the objective. And the United States is following that strategy. But not many knows about it.
While it is true that foremost in our minds are the issues on conflict and potential of war in our region, but I would like also to pose a question about promoting peace. And I'd like to pay honor to Premier Chow En-lai, who initiated the 5 principles of coexistence. When China, after the founding of the People's Republic, started to deal with its neighbors in promoting the 5 principles of coexistence. Later, it was adopted in Bandung, 68 years ago this month, April. And later, the same principles adopted by the ASEAN, adopted by the United Nations. But no one seems to be discussing peace. Everyone is talking about war. So anyone who would like to join me in promoting peace? That's the question.
Who is now provoking war in the region? Is it China or US?
What is the strategic intention of the US? I think it's very clear. There's beyond any doubt amongst intellectual scholars and so on that the US is in a drive for war. Mauro Samontes says, it is given that the objective of the US is to defeat China. My final question is, how is this going to be done? What's taking place in the South China Sea is too obvious for comfort. All attention is being brought to the expanded EDCA together with war exercises in the South China Sea, just as all attention was brought to the Allied preparations for the attack on Pas-de-Calais. What actually took place was called the Allied invasion at Normandy, called D-Day, which signaled the ultimate defeat of the Germans. What would be the final US move in analogy of Operation Overlord that resulted in the successful D-Day? This is a very long history, Mauro.
I can share with you a story. You know, I have talked about with our US counterparts several times on that if the China sent thousands sources of aircraft and hundreds of warships every year approaching US, what the US will do? These guys, these guys almost perform the same. Firstly, keep silent. Then say, if you doing that, you are the changes of status quo. So I think China is in a very defensive position in the power competition. All the encounters, maritime and air encounters are happened in China's surrounding waters, sometimes in China's airspace. So China definitely is in defensive position. If the US were in China's position, I think the US maybe is too much anxiety in China.
Yes.
I think that between China and the Philippines, I think that for the long term, we have something to do. And in the short term, we have another thing to do. Well, for the long term, we still need to resolve the dispute, maritime dispute between us, and only between us, not the involvement of any extra-regional countries, because that's only between us. And maybe we can deal with it under the BCM or diplomatic talks, negotiations, et cetera, but it takes time, and we do aware of that. But in the short term, there is exactly something that we can do. Like, for example, after President Marcos' visit to China, we established this hotline between foreign ministries in China and the Philippines. And this hotline, I think, really works, you know, in the incidents happened during these 3 months. So I think it's working. And also I'm thinking, that's my personal thinking and suggestion. I'm thinking maybe we can establish a hotline in between our defense departments or maritime law enforcement departments. You know, when anything happens and we can manage the crisis, you know, at 1 minute or 1 second, or in a very short time, when anything happens, the two law enforcement agencies can call each other and talk to each other and to manage the crisis among us. So this is the suggestion that, in my mind, from my personal point of view, that we can do. I really think that we can do.
The National Intelligence Agency of the United States itself, in a Senate hearing, March 10, reported, China doesn't want a war over Taiwan. U.S. Spy Chief Avril Haines says. This is in a official Senate hearing. They know China does not want war. No, that's the important point. Because all the details, when we discuss it, we lose track of the strategic picture. And this is the real strategic picture. China is not the one pushing for war. And if it is sensing some insecurity because of the actions of the Americans, there is justification for it. Okay.
With regards to the question of columnist Mau Samonte, how will the United States achieve their objective of stopping China's rise by 2025? Well, there are three main elements of this strategy on how the United States intend to stop China's rise. First, the war that they are going to wage will be regional, limited to the region in the South China Sea, but that will include all the ASEAN states. That will affect also Japan and South Korea and the Philippines, and perhaps Australia as well. They want to keep the conflict limited to this region so that Europe and the United States, North America will not be affected. That's the purpose of that strategy. Second, conventional war. They want to keep the war conventional, not going to nuclear. Why? Because with the nuclear war, the United States will also be wiped out. China has the capability now to wipe out the entire United States with their nuclear weapons. What more if Russia joins China? So the whole world will be, the whole of humanity will be adversely affected. Third, the third element of that strategy is protracted war. They want to protract the war because the longer the war is allowed to drag on, the greater will be the fall of China's economy. But that is a pipe dream because China now has the capability of wiping out the 400 military bases in less than a day. China has the capability of wiping out all the C4ISR based on satellites because China has the capability to shoot down those satellites from the ground. And China has the capability of wiping out the US Navy that enters this area. Every single floating warship can be destroyed by China's anti-ship ballistic missiles. So the US dream of protracting this war is a pipe dream because China can defeat the United States within, if not days, hours.
It was upon the initiative of the Philippine Coast Guard and the Chinese Coast Guard to enter into a memorandum of agreement regarding maintaining communications and protocol in 2017. Unfortunately, under the Duterte administration, Secretary Locsin scrapped the agreement because he viewed it as a turf invasion of his turf, being the Foreign Relations Secretary at that time. But that was an unfortunate decision on the part of Locsin. So currently, there is no existing line of communication, a formal line of, I'm sure there's some line of communication, but there's no formal line of communication, which brings me back to the point that I raised yesterday about functional COCs. We need functional COCs that can be put in place immediately while we negotiate the broader framework COC. And these functional COCs can be along the lines of Coast Guard to Coast Guard, Fisheries Association to Fisheries Association, D8, Department of Agriculture and Fisheries with the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries of the other side, and down the line. Even with respect to energy, we can have the China National or Offshore Oil Corporation and PNOC having some form of agreement when it comes to the allowing the passage of survey ships from outside of the South China Sea going to into the service contract areas on the shore of the Philippines. And these are undisputed service contract areas. And the entry of these survey vessels has been frozen because of the perception that if there are survey vessels coming into the Philippine shorelines, China will attack those surveys, which is, for me, quite ridiculous. So right now, we have a moratorium on oil and gas exploration in the West Philippine Sea, and that moratorium is a self-inflicted damage to the Philippines, which I don't understand why until now it's not being lifted.
You said the agreement was scrapped. Can anyone or any group in the government revive that one with China? The one that was scrapped, can it be revived in a better way? Can you suggest?
I don't
Coast Guard to
suppose
Coast Guard?
it was the DFA that scrapped the agreement between the two Coast Guards, and I think the initiative has to come from the DFA.
Yes.
We have a problem here, which is on the Philippine side, because to exacerbate matters in the Philippine Coast Guard, the Commandant, Admiral Abu, even appointed a spokesperson for the West Philippine Sea, who reports to media directly. And it's also perhaps an unfair observation, but it's becoming a perception that even our Secretary of National Defense is not reporting to the President, but to a foreign country. So to answer the question on whether leadership is involved here on our side, I'm sorry to say and admit this in front of our Chinese friends, that we have a lot to do, but Dr. Loha already admitted her exasperation along this matter. For instance, I appreciate the statement earlier of the Chinese panel that Taiwan is not a business of the Philippines. That is a bold statement that should reverberate in the ears of our media friends here. Taiwan is not a Philippine business. The US is an expert in building scenarios. And I am not personally convinced that the US will war in terms of a hot war, a shooting war versus China. It is my evaluation that the US is engaged in lawfare and information war. Why? Because after the Pelosi visit, realizing China's preparedness, the US withdrew all its assets to 3,000 kilometers from Taiwan. In other words, it ran with its tail between its legs. And it's not willing to risk an accident. So I read here that the motive behind the saber rattling is a dead herring or a diversion from an impending collapse of the U.S. economy. The U.S. is hiding from its own people its economic woes. And by way of diverting it, they go into a shooting war in Ukraine without boots on the ground, and is provoking these exacerbations and using the Philippines as a pawn, perhaps, for pre-positioning, which may not even happen because maybe it's about time that it's announced here that there will be a challenge in the Supreme Court about the constitutionality not only of EDCA, but of the Visiting Forces Agreement and the Mutual Defense Treaty. Because precisely of Section 25, Article 18 of the Constitution, that any treaty existing after 1991 should be subject to Senate ratification and or referendum by the people and concurrence by the other state. The three agreements, the EDCA, the BFA, and the Mutual Defense Treaty, does not conform to this basic constitutional requirement. And how the Supreme Court overlooked that is again something that frustrates me.